Hello, I'm Sally Pointer. Welcome to the second part of my series on Neolithic textile tools, and today we're starting with an unlikely sounding material. This is a pair of beef rib bones left over from a particularly good roast dinner from quite some time ago. We don't often have things quite that nice, but we deserved it. One of the tools that we find at the pile dwelling sites are combs made out of split rib bones. So the plan here is to take off this thin edge of bone, which should let me then split these across the middle, and then we will assemble them into combs and have a look at how they might have been used. I'm not going to use prehistoric tools for this particular job. I'm going to take a modern saw to this. Oh, that was a messy job. So I've trimmed down the edges on both of them. This one I haven't split yet. This one, the long one, 24 centimetres long, I have. So those fitted together. I just sawed down the sides and then popped a chisel in, gave it a twist. They came apart very easily. So I did use modern tools, but the same thing would have been achieved with flints doing a scrape and splinter technique. That's the leftovers. Might get something out of those, not really sure. What I need to decide now is whether I actually need this bit for this particular project, or whether, given that those are quite long, whether cutting them in half will give me enough bits to strap together into a comb. I'd better go and check the original references. Okay, after a bit of dithering, I've finally come to a decision. I've split the other bone in half, and I'm going to turn these three into a pronged tool. So this is the part that went with that one. This is the bone I split earlier. So that's the roughed out shape. I'm going to make 3 tines of a similar shape, and then we'll grind them and finish them. This one, because there are quite a lot of single pointed tools known from these sites, is going to be a standalone pokey thing, because pokey things are incredibly useful in all sorts of textile techniques. I am going to rough out the shape using a modern saw, and then what I've done so far is I just took a chisel to the inside to take out the worst of the pithy bits. I'll refine that by grinding. So 10 minutes with modern tools, and then we'll get back to the prehistoric analogous bits. Well, I have to say, cutting bone is a filthy and disgusting job when you're doing it with power tools. It's actually much nicer to do by hand. Now then, the reason I am standing out here looking at a pile of fleece is because I want to use one of those quern stones to grind, but this fleece is here because when I got out of the shed a couple of days ago, I found a wasp's nest in it. And I've been waiting for them to go away. They're not there yet. So the question is, can I come over here and do some work without making them cross? Let's try it and see. So here are my bones roughed out. This is the one that's going to be a standalone item, and these 3 will go together. What I want to do is use the stone, and this is millstone grit, really nice coarse stuff, to just refine the shape. There's nothing that complicated to it. It really is just a case of grinding away, get some of this base layer out. I might add water later if I need to, but I think actually, can you see how that's doing quite well already? That is going to do the trick. Not sure how long it's going to take. I'm guessing half an hour maybe to get these to the shapes I want. Then we can look at making them a little bit prettier and tying them together. And there's Tesla quality controlling them. They're not for you to eat. I did the rough out on the stone, and then I took them into the workshop to finish on a little bit of sandpaper because the wasps were a little bit cross. What do you think? No? All right. Anyway, that is a standalone tool. Just needs oiling and polishing. These ones will fit together, and they're not for scratching cats. Well, maybe they are. What do we think? Oh, Apparently we have solved the mystery. They are for scratching cats. It'll be better when it's tied together. It will, honestly. There's some evidence that some of these tools were glued as well as bound together, so I am going to make some Stone Age style glue. One possibility would be birch tar. That would be brilliant. I just don't have any to hand, but I do have pine resin. This was collected in Scotland, 20 years ago. Been waiting for something to do with that. Beeswax and some very finely ground charcoal. Lots of different proportions to be explored here. I'm going to start this mix with 12 grams of pine resin, 4 grams of beeswax, up to 4 grams of charcoal. Then I'll try it, and if it needs a little tweak in any direction, I will do that. Now, the pine resin is fairly well powdered, but if it's very powdered, it'll melt a little faster. So, tiny little handstone, little tiny quern. I use this for spices and things a lot. I'm going to get the resin in there, get it to a fine powder, put it into a nice little heat-proof dish, not very Stone Age, but you know what, it'll do. And put that over heat until it all melts and I can stir it together. A handstone is a really useful bit of kit. Doesn't have to be big, but it's amazing how much better things work if you can grind them up finely. That's the resin and the wax melted. They do take a fair bit of stirring to actually get them to amalgamate together. That will get easier when the charcoal goes in. That's half the charcoal in, and that's actually looking pretty good. We can gather this up on a stick, and then I just need to warm that up when I want to stick things together. It's time to glue these together. So this is my batch of glue. It's nice and warm. So you saw me earlier putting some on sticks, but I've melted a batch of it. Now, I want to glue these together before I lash them. The lashing is going to do most of the work, but I want to try and get these sitting roughly equally. Now, the one with the biggest curve are this pair, so I'm going to start with those. I don't know exactly the best way to do this, so I think we'll try a really good dollop of glue down the middle, if it'll stick. And yeah, I was a bit worried about this. The bone, because it's quite smooth, is not providing the best. So, but that's all right. I just need it to hold it together while I get the lashings on, and it provides a bit of padding. So that's good, and then we'll use lashing to bring the top in. Okay, I think that's all right. That is going to come apart if I pull. I think it's okay. I think it's all right. I can always unstick it and do it again if I decide that that's not quite how it needs to be. And then this one is going to go on there, and hopefully with a similar sort of spacing. Now this one is rough side to rough side, so I'm hoping that we do a bit better with the stickiness. Might just warm that up again. This stuff, once it does start setting, really does go for it. Okay. Right, we can do this. Lining up the bottoms as best I can. Lining up the tops. Squidging that together. Yeah, that side's popped off. That's okay. I can re-warm that and redo it. This side I think is going to behave rather better because, as I said, it's rough side to rough side. Okay, I'm going to rewarm that, stick it back together again. We can always have another go. Oh, yeah, it's doing the right things. It's just, might scratch that a little bit. Also, I oiled these yesterday, didn't I? I oiled the bones, so they're even more likely to want to not stick. Right, back in a second. Right, that has had a blast of heat and is just liquefying. While that comes back to working temperature, nail file, bone. So we're not too worried about this side because it's got the slightly gritty element already of the spongy section. But let's just take the shine off that. That is better. Now, that looks pretty good there. Those are reasonably even. If I can just flatten that out of it. That'll do. The rest of this I can do with the bindings. So I need to make some string. Because we're fairly sure these are for use on flax, I think I'm going to make flax string for this. Right, let's just move some things out of the way. Okay, there is roughly 2 meters of linen string there. This is some that I made whilst demonstrating a few, well, who knows how long ago. Anyway, it's going to do the trick very nicely. You don't need to see me making more string. I think, do I want to add some more glue down the gaps? What I don't want it to do is leak when we have really, really hot weather, but I wouldn't mind it helping to just catch the string into place. I might fill some of these gaps just a little bit. Might help stabilise everything. Good stuff. The plan is to essentially make a handle out of the string, but then also take it between the tines so that it helps stop the flax seed heads, assuming that we are right in our interpretation, from getting stuck further down, and also to help keep everything lined up. Loads of glue, loads of it. Do love this stuff. I would like to work more with birch tar, but I haven't got easy access to it at the moment. So this really isn't bad. Okay, let's brush those bits off. And let's start lashing. I think we're going to do it that way up. All right, so we are going to go nice and tightly because we're using the glue and the pressure of the bones to keep everything together there. We are having very hot weather at the moment, so I'm going to be interested to see whether the glue does melt a bit and seep into the bindings. Won't be the end of the world if it does. So whether I've got enough string here. I do have a lot more string, so I'm not too worried about that, but this just seemed a convenient sized piece. Right, I'm going to go up a bit, wrap around here a few times. And then I'm going to figure of 8 through the tines which I think I have seen in some of the originals, to act as a sort of shock absorber and spacer. And then all the way around a couple of times just to bring this in a little tiny bit. And then we need to finish off. So yet again, what have I done with my needle? I do keep forgetting about needles. Onto a bone needle. Wasn't planning on it, but because I've got two ends there, I might knock those off just to stop it undoing. That looks okay. Question will now be whether it works or not. I have no idea if that's too much glue or not. Well, it'll do for the moment. We'll try it out when we get a chance. I just need to wait for the flax to ripen now. I've also been trying it as a tool for splitting things like nettles, and actually it works really quite well for that. Once the nettles are split open, they're much easier to peel to get at the bast strips. And any tool that helps you subdivide and conquer is a good idea. So I can also use this to help me split this into thinner ribbons, which then when they're dry become much easier to rub down into finer strands. I'm not saying this is necessarily what this was for, but it's just an indication of the range of uses that a bone spike can be used for. I'd actually probably use a slightly smaller one for nettles if I was adding one to my regular toolkit. Just yet another thing to think about though. I've come down to an overgrown path next to the river to harvest a little bit of willow bark. Now, one of the things that has been suggested for these tools is that some of them may have been involved in bark processing. Perhaps not the bladed ones so much as the single-tined ones, but it's always worth double checking. So, a little bit of willow is going to get cut. With harvesting willow, it's one of those trees that actually really likes being cut. Generally, as long as you choose your tree carefully and you only take a small branch from an area where it's growing well and it's not in any way uncommon, there's no issues here. In this case, this is from a partially felled tree, which is blocking a pathway. So it's actually doing a good job getting this out of the way. I'm just going to saw it off and then we're going to take it home and finish dealing with it. It's actually a bit later in the season than I'd normally pick willow, but we've had rain in the last few days and we're growing by water here. So look, that bark is coming off very nicely. I don't want to mess around with it though till we get it home because we need to try these tools. This branch has got a little bit of torn bark already from where I took it off the tree, so I'm just going to turn it over to give me a fresh bit to experiment with. Now, peeling willow bark is a very well-known technique. It's just a case of scoring it and then easing the bark off. I could use a flint to score it, but I actually want to see if the point on this is sharp enough to go through this. This is slightly late season bark. It's mid-July, but we've had rain. So I'm hoping that this is going to go through at a depth that means that we can cut the bark off nicely. one of the reasons we think this is a possible use is that there's been traceology studies, so wear mark studies done, and they're finding quite a lot of polish along these very top edges, which does seem to be consistent with the points being used more than the bodies. Well, that certainly is cutting through. Okay, so far, so good. Now then, what I think this is going to be really good for is levering this bark off. Quite often people do this with a short stick. We often call it a spud for some peculiar reason. I've never quite worked out why. But yeah, this little bone tool is certainly working really well to ease that. After a bit of playing with this, particularly if you use the whole length of it, that actually is really quite nice to help ease the bark off. Wear marks are probably here in the original tool, so I don't know whether this whole blade use is really plausible or not, but yeah, I'm quite happy with that as a basic idea. I'm not being terribly careful with this. See what it's like for easing things around knot holes. That's pretty good. Okay, and then once you've got most of it eased, the rest will come off. Right, so there is our piece of bark. I could peel it. What we tend to do if you're peeling bark is, let's have a small section at the end, is try and take off that outer layer to leave just the inner one. I don't think this by itself is necessarily going to be a massive help with that. Maybe a little bit. I think you do far better with a sharp flint. Where I think it really is going to come into its own though is in separating bark into thinner strips. And what you can do with bark once it's in strips, let's just do a slightly longer bit so I've got more to play with, is strips can be rolled up until you need them to be used in basketry. Plenty of people online who show this in a far tidier way than I'm doing it at this moment. Or you can boil this in wood ashes to break down those fibres and get them into a format where they can be turned into cordage. And we know that willow cordage is very much in use in these areas. So this is definitely a good tool for getting the bark off the trees. It's quite a nice tool for subdividing strips. It's essentially a blunt knife, and that does fit with the polish marks that have been seen. We think these are for flax, but let's just try it as an option for making several strips at once. Well, my version I think is probably a little bit chunky. It's not that it didn't work, but I don't think that's the most useful way of going about that. Okay, that's fine. This was a proof of concept. Some researchers have identified wear marks on these as probably being from bark. I'm quite happy with that, particularly in the context of just levering off the outer layer. And for strips, in this instance, or this particular tool, perhaps not so much for advanced bark processing. That's great. One experiment down, several more to go. One of the things we think these may have been for is riffling flax. Now, riffling is the process of taking off these seed heads. And this particular bunch of flax was very kindly sent to me by Alan Brown from Nettles for Textiles. And you might notice it looks a lot greener than a lot of flax that you'll be more familiar with seeing. This has been picked very, very young, so that the fibre is of maximum fineness, but it's not really about getting a seed crop. So this is very early season flax. It's going to be really interesting to compare using this tool on this to using it just to comb out later season retted flax. Now, the way we think this works is just a case of using these gaps between the tines to comb away the seed pods. I think I mentioned when I was making this. This is absolutely within the parameters of the found ones, but I think I might have my spacing just a little bit wide. I think most of the originals, the gap between the tines isn't any thicker than the thickness of the blade themselves. That one, I think that might be a little bit on the dense side. So we're going to try it. This is also very early season flax, being picked green, so the seed heads are quite small. It should just be a case of combing it. Let's try it. Well, that certainly works, doesn't it? Now, one thing I have noticed straight away is that it's certainly popping off the seed heads, but it's leaving the little base that was the base of the flower. I wonder if that's because this is still quite green and fresh. So I'm not unhappy with that as a proof of concept, but I think I am going to let this dry out for a few more days before I give it another testing. We really didn't know whether this was going to be best used fairly fresh or when it's a lot drier. So yeah, it works to a point. I think it might work even better in a day or two. Bear with me. I will come back when this has had a little bit more sunlight. While we're waiting, there is something else I can try. Now this is flax that's been retted, so it's used bacterial action, probably in either fields or in a pond for a few days to break down the barky layer. It's been scutched, so it's been broken with a beater, and then scutched is when you beat a blade against the side of it to take all the twiggy parts away. What it hasn't been yet is combed through, hackled. And some of the, particularly the early researchers, thought that these were probably flax hackles. So let's try it. This is a very scruffy piece. It's been kicking around in my box for a while. I don't see any reason why it shouldn't work just to comb through. And I would expect with hackling, particularly flax of this particular quality, that we're going to get quite a lot of toe coming off. Toe is the short, scruffy fibres. They can still be used, but they're not the long, smooth fibres that you want for fine work. Okay, so very few passes. That's looking a lot better. There is our toe fibre. So it's still perfectly usable, and if this was combed through again, generally it will improve. We'll just get rid of all the odds and ends and leave bits that can still be spun or corded or used for coarser things. It was often used as things like caulking to stop up seams on boats and things. So that's still usable, but this is the fine fibre, the line fibre, that's going to be much, much easier to spin. I don't think there's any doubt at all that this works very, very well as a basic hackle. I'm not having to give it any real thought. It's very comfortable in the hand. It's just like combing through hair, and the more I do it, the more toe I'll remove, and the fewer but finer and better aligned fibres I'll have left. So we'll call that one a win. This definitely works as a hackle. Some of these are known with up to 5 blades. That would work really well. There are some with as few as 2. But it's a device for combing things out. So far, that seems very, very plausible indeed. The green flax has had another 5 days drying now. We are having a lot of rain, so there's humidity in the air, but it is basically nice and dry. Can you hear how crispy It is. So I think this is going to give me a slightly better idea of how efficient the prongs are for just rippling off the seed heads. It's really just a case of getting these out of the way so the rest of the stalk can be processed, and the seed, although it is a little underripe, you can see there how pale it is, but so the seed can be used for food or other purposes. So, nothing very complicated about it, it's just a case of combing it off. That's much better, isn't it? Remember how that last clip looked? I was having to put a little bit of effort into it, and I was still having lots of the green bits staying behind. Now look, the little calyxes are staying put. I think that is because they're picked green, they're still very firmly attached, little bit underripe, but there is absolutely no doubt that cleanly and quickly got rid of those. One stuck in between there, but that comes out. But that is the prong that I thought was a little bit widely spaced. Okay, I think we can call that one a success. I do want to try it with very ripe flax, if I can find a bit. I'm sure I've got some here somewhere, but otherwise we're very, very nearly there with trying this one out. I'm not sure how well this clip is going to come out because I'm working at a very strange angle, but down in the depths of my bundle of retted flax, I did find some properly mature, dried out seed heads, and I think this tool is going to work really well on these very, very mature and dried heads. So let's give it a try. Do you see this popping off? That's exactly what I thought would happen, and it's not leaving much of the sort of calyx bit behind. Little bit though, which is quite reassuring. 2, 3, pop. Yeah, I'm really happy with that. There's no doubt that works. The experiments I've tried with the slightly green, very fresh, very young flax shows that it works on that. On much, much more mature, drier flax, all these seed heads have just popped off without any difficulty at all. That is a terrible picture, really sorry about that. And there's the seeds inside. Yeah, I'm happy with that. We've tried these in several different ways now. The simple tool, these are very well represented in the archaeological record. There are lots and lots and lots of these. Some are very small, some are very big. This is pretty much in the middle of the sort of size range. These ones we think work extremely well as a tool for scoring, levering, manipulating bark. It would have lots of other uses as well though. I can think of so many small weaving and basketry processes where a flat but pointy and strong bone blade is extremely useful. We see bone points throughout the archaeological record. We're never probably going to pin down exactly what any individual one was for, but that wear mark on the top, that really is a good clue as to how people were using these best part of 5,000 years ago. These ones, the multi-bladed bone combs, were identified back in the 19th century by the first antiquarians who looked at these sites as flax hackles. And I don't think they're wrong, I really don't. They do work as ripples. We've tried them on very fresh green flax, we've tried them on slightly drier green flax, we've tried it on a very small amount of extremely dry, lightly retted, mature flax. It works perfectly well for removing those seed heads. Where I think it really comes into its own though is there's a heavy duty handheld hackle for just combing through bundles of flax or potentially other fibres before they're refined into a very fine state. Either way, it's still a multi-purpose tool, in the same way that we could take this away from textiles and think of it in use for, I don't know, scraping fish skins or even gutting fish. It would work for things like that. This sort of tool would work to help pick berries, for example. I could imagine bilberries, the wild blueberries, coming off very, very easily with a tool like this. We think, though, that they're associated with textiles, and this really does work when we try it in that context. So that's part 2 of my sequence on Neolithic textile tools based on finds from the Swiss and other, in that area, pile dwelling villages. There's one more video to go. Watch out for the next one, which is all about that thorn flax hackle that quite a lot of you have been really looking forward to seeing. Bye for now.